So let's start with one of the big questions historians still ask about the Civil War. Did Lincoln free the slaves? The answer, as with so much here on Crash Course, is yes, and also no. Let's go straight to the thought bubble today. So Lincoln's reputation as the great emancipator rests largely on his Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order which went into effect on January 1st, 1863. This order ostensibly freed all the slaves in territory currently rebelling against the United States, i.e. in areas where the U.S. government had no authority to free slaves. This is rather like the United States announcing that from here on out North Korea will be ruled by Lady Gaga. Sure, it's a great idea, but it's not really your jurisdiction. In areas where the U.S. did have the authority to free slaves, the border states and some of the areas of the Confederacy that had been effectively conquered and occupied by federal troops, those slaves were not freed. So Lincoln didn't free the slaves that he actually had the power to free. Many historians argue that in fact slaves freed themselves. How? By running away to Union lines and becoming, quote, contrabands. Because this was a time of war and slaves were seen as a valuable resource to the enemy, when they escaped and sought refuge with Union troops, Union commanders wouldn't give them back despite fugitive slave laws still being on the books. So many slaves escaped, the argument goes, that Lincoln was basically forced to issue the Emancipation Proclamation because until he did so, those contraband slaves were still technically property of their Southern masters and the Union generals were breaking American laws by not returning them. The Emancipation Proclamation then had the added bonus of encouraging more slaves to come over to the Union lines, many of whom joined the Army, which eventually included about 180,000 former slaves and free black men. All that noted, I think Lincoln does deserve some credit for freeing the slaves for two reasons. First, he pushed for the 13th Amendment, which actually ended slavery in the United States, and perhaps more importantly, he continued the war to its conclusion and demanded that the end of slavery and the return of the Southern states to the Union be conditions for peace. This may seem obvious today, but in 1864 it wasn't. The Civil War helped singularize what had been until then a plural nation. And Abraham Lincoln was the first president to truly expand the power of the executive. He ordered blockades and suspended habeas corpus, in addition to emancipating the slaves. But the Republican-dominated Congress played a role in this federalization too. Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862 that encouraged settlement of the West by basically giving away land to anyone who had $18 and was willing to live on it and farm it for 5 years. Meanwhile, the Morrill Land Grant Act financed colleges to offer training in new scientific agricultural techniques. The Department of Agriculture was created to generate statistics and share best practices in farming. Congress also helped unify the country with massive land grants in the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. And during the war, the Lincoln administration gave away 158 million acres to railroads to tie the nation together.